Julian Ashcombe, Duke of Thornbury, stood at his own front gate and did not know what he was looking at. He had left an empty house behind him, a locked west wing, dust sheets over the good furniture, and a bride he privately expected to be buried before the first frost. He had been gone 2.5 years. The gate in front of him now was mended and freshly painted. The drive beyond it was raked smooth. Lamplight-filled windows he remembered as dark, and somewhere past the hedge line, faint on the March wind, someone was laughing. He put his hand on the cold iron and did not open it. A man does not expect to feel like an intruder at his own door. Julian had imagined this return 100 times in hospital cots and troop trains. Imagined guilt, imagined a grave, imagined the flat, airless silence of a house that had given up waiting for him. He had not imagined this. Warmth, sound, a house that looked from where he stood, entirely capable of continuing without him. Smoke rose straight and even from a chimney he remembered as cold for years before he'd ever left it. Someone had cut back the ivy that used to choke the east windows. A dog he didn't recognize barked once from the direction of the stables and was answered, not scolded, by a voice he also didn't recognize. Even the gravel under his boots felt wrong, packed tight and even. No ruts, no weeds pushing through, the kind of drive that gets walked on every day by people who belong there. He had spent 2.5 years picturing a house exactly as broken as the marriage that had built it. He had not once pictured this. To understand what unsettled him more than any battlefield had, you have to go back nearly 3 years to a wedding arranged in 6 weeks and finished in one afternoon that neither of them wanted to remember. In the autumn of 1899, Elias Calvert of Pittsburgh owned 4 steel mills, half a railway line, and a daughter he intended to turn into a duchess. The contract had taken his lawyers 4 months to draft and his daughter 4 minutes to understand. She was the price of Thornbury Hall's roof, its tenant cottages, its unpaid wages, and the coal that kept its west wing from freezing solid every winter for the last decade. Margaret Calvert, Daisy, to the few who loved her, though her father was not among them in any way that mattered, had been sick for 3 weeks before the wedding, not fashionably delicate, actually sick. Pneumonia, caught crossing the Atlantic in a fog that soaked through every coat on the ship, and a fever that climbed high enough that the ship's doctor had used the word dangerous twice in one sentence. Her father postponed nothing. The contract had a date on it, and dates in Elias Calvert's experience were the only part of an agreement that could not be renegotiated after signing. She married Julian Ashcombe on the 2nd of October, standing upright through an act of will alone, her hand cold in his, her voice carrying only because she refused to let it fail in front of witnesses. She counted that as the first real accomplishment of her marriage, staying vertical for 11 minutes.
I'm told I should thank you for waiting until I could stand.
Julian looked at her properly, for perhaps the first time since the ceremony began. Pale beneath the veil, a fine sheen of fever sweat at her hairline that no amount of rice powder had quite hidden. Eyes a deep, steady green that held his without flinching even though the rest of her looked ready to fold.
I didn't arrange the date.
No, I don't suppose either of us arranged much of this.
It was the truest thing said at Thornbury Hall that day, and neither of them said anything else quite that honest for a long while after. The house that received her was not cruel. Exactly. It was simply not interested. Mrs. Whitcomb, who had run the household through 2 duchesses and 1 long widowhood, received the new bride with a curtsy precisely as deep as protocol required and not 1 inch deeper. The staff addressed her correctly. They did not, in the ways that mattered, see her. Margaret noticed. She was very tired and very far from anyone who had ever loved her, and she noticed everything. For 8 days, she and Julian occupied the same house the way 2 guests at an inn occupy adjoining rooms, polite at breakfast, absent by design the rest of the day. He had his ledgers and his land agent, and the deliberate busyness of a man avoiding a conversation he does not know how to begin. She had a fever that would not fully break, and long afternoons in a room that still held, in the wardrobe and the writing desk, traces of whichever Ashcombe wife had used it before her. On the fourth night, a storm caught them both on the road back from a required dinner at a neighboring house, and the carriage axle cracked half a mile from the gate. They stood together under the carriage lamp in the freezing rain while the driver worked, close enough that she could feel the heat of him through her soaked cloak, neither of them speaking, both of them entirely too aware of the other's breathing.
You should be inside. You're not strong yet.
I've been told that since I was 11 years old, Your Grace, it's never once been useful information.
He almost smiled. She saw the almost and filed it away, because in 8 days it was the closest thing to warmth she had been offered. On the 9th day, a telegram arrived from the War Office. War had broken out in South Africa 4 days earlier. Julian held an active commission in the Shropshire Light Dragoons, and the Dragoons were sailing within the fortnight. He read the telegram twice at the breakfast table, and Margaret watched something in him unclench that she did not, at the time, understand.
You look relieved.
I look like a man who has orders.
That isn't what I said.
He didn't answer that. He folded the telegram along its crease and set it beside his plate with the careful precision of a man handling something he does not want to examine too closely. And Margaret understood, without being told, that leaving cost him nothing he was willing to name aloud, that some part of him was grateful for a war, because a war asked less of him than she did. She did not say this. There are things a bride of 9 days learns to keep to herself. He left on the 14th of October. She stood at the top of the front steps in a shawl too thin for the morning, watching the carriage take him down the drive, and Mrs. Whitcomb stood beside her at a correct distance and said nothing at all. And the house behind them was very large and very quiet, and Margaret understood that this was very likely what the next several years of her life would sound like. The fever came back 9 days after he sailed. It came back the way pneumonia returns in a body that never properly finished fighting it the first time. Quietly, then all at once, until Margaret Ashcombe, Duchess of Thornbury, was a shape under blankets in the east bedroom, breathing in a way that frightened the housemaid enough to send for the doctor at 2 in the morning without waiting for permission. Dr. Alden Fenwick had delivered half the village and buried the other half's grandparents. He looked at the young American Duchess, burning and barely conscious in a bed too large for her, and said the kind of sentence a doctor says only when he has stopped being careful with his words. She may not last the week. Mrs. Whitcomb heard this standing in the doorway with a basin of water in her hands, and something in her, some old, practical, unsentimental part of a woman who had spent 40 years keeping this house alive through duchesses who came and went, decided, in that moment, without any real tenderness in it, that she was not going to let a girl die alone in a house that had already sent her husband away. She did not do it for love. She would have told you that herself, had you asked. She did it because someone had to, and there was no one else in the room. For 6 days, Mrs. Whitcomb and Dr. Fenwick fought the fever between them. Cold compresses, broth forced between cracked lips, a window cracked for air against every old superstition about night chill. Margaret does not remember most of it. What she remembers later, in fragments, is a voice, not gentle, exactly, but steady, saying the same 6 words over and over in the dark. You are not doing this today. On the 7th morning, the fever broke. Margaret woke to gray daylight, a raw throat, and Mrs. Whitcomb asleep upright in a chair beside the bed, still in yesterday's apron, a rosary she did not usually carry twisted around one hand. Margaret watched her for a long moment before she spoke, because she understood, even half-conscious, that she was looking at something she had not expected to find in this house.
You didn't have to stay.
Mrs. Whitcomb woke instantly, the way people do who have spent their lives being needed at odd hours, and looked at her new duchess with an expression that had, for the first time, something other than correctness in it. Someone had to, and you were far too stubborn to make it easy on either of us. It was not affection, not yet, but it was the first true sentence anyone in that house had spoken to her, and Margaret held on to it the way a person holds on to the first solid thing after a long fall. She wrote her first letter to Julian from that bed, hands still unsteady, ink blotting where her fingers shook. I was very ill, and I am recovering, and the house has been kinder to me than I expected, though I could not tell you why. I hope South Africa is treating you with more mercy than pneumonia has treated me. Yours, Margaret. She did not mention the fever nearly killed her. She did not know yet that the letter would take 11 weeks to reach a camp that had already moved twice by the time it arrived, or that Julian would read it standing in mud with artillery sounds somewhere on the horizon, and feel something close to shame that he could not immediately identify, and fold it into his breast pocket and not write back for 3 weeks because he did not know what an honest answer would look like. What are you actually enjoying about this story so far? The house, the war, the two of them figuring out who they are to each other? Drop a like if you're invested. It genuinely helps a channel like this get found by people who'd like this kind of story too. Recovery for Margaret took the better part of a month. Boredom, once strength returned, took considerably less time to become unbearable. She had been raised to run a household of 11 servants in Pittsburgh and had married into a house of 31 that did not require her opinion on anything, and by the 3rd week of December she had decided this arrangement was not acceptable. She asked to see the estate ledgers. Mr. Sedley, the land agent, brought them to her with the visible reluctance of a man humoring an invalid, and was visibly startled when the invalid read every page, asked 4 questions he could not answer cleanly, and returned the ledgers the following morning with 7 pages of notes in a firm, unhesitating hand.
The Marlowe cottage roof has been listed as urgent for 11 months.
There hasn't been the money for it, Your Grace, Mr. Sedley told her, in the tone of a man who expected that to end the conversation.
There's money for the wine cellar restocking on page 40. Explain the difference to me.
He could not, in fact, explain the difference to her satisfactorily, and by January the Marlowe roof was mended, and the wine cellar restocking was postponed, and Mr. Sedley had begun, very slightly, to knock before entering rooms she was in. This was, Margaret would come to understand, the first change she had made in that house that actually held. She kept writing letters, weekly, then twice weekly, though only 1 in 5 ever seemed to arrive at whatever muddy camp Julian's regiment occupied that month, and fewer still received an answer. She did not know this at the time, did not know that his silence was not indifference but a kind of grim, guilty inability to find words that felt honest, and she decided, rather than assume the worst, to write as though he were reading every one, because the alternative was to stop, and stopping felt like conceding something she wasn't ready to concede. I have reopened the East Wing. It had been closed since before your father died. Mrs. Whitcomb tells me, out of some grief none of the staff will fully explain to me. I am not trying to disturb anything that should stay settled. I only wanted somewhere with morning light. She did not know, writing that the East Wing had been closed since Julian's mother died in it, or that Mrs. Whitcomb had allowed her to open it anyway, without a word of objection, because some old and complicated grief in that house had finally found a reason to let the light back in. In South Africa, the war Julian had welcomed as a clean, uncomplicated obligation had stopped being either of those things by the spring of 1900. The set battles gave way to something slower and meaner. Commandos striking at rail lines and supply columns, retreating into country that swallowed men whole, a war with no clear front and no clear end, fought against an enemy that refused to stand still long enough to be defeated properly. He wrote to Margaret exactly 4 times in 6 months. Each letter was shorter than the last. He told himself this was the war. Some part of him, the part that read her letters twice before folding them away, suspected it was cowardice of a specific and unglamorous kind. He did not know how to be honest with a wife he had married for her father's money and did not yet believe he had any right to feel anything about. The one man in the regiment who seemed to see this clearly was Corporal Hicks, a Birmingham locksmith's son who had signed up for the adventure and found, like most of them, considerably less adventure than advertised. He shared Julian's tent through the wet months outside the Modder River, and he was not, by rank or manners, entitled to speak plainly to a duke, which never once stopped him. "You've read that letter 3 times tonight, sir," Hicks said, not looking up from his own boots, "and you still haven't written back."
I don't know what I'd say to her.
"Might try the truth," Hicks said. "I hear it's cheaper than the alternative." Julian did not write back that night either. He told himself it was the war keeping him from it. He was beginning, privately, to suspect otherwise, and the suspicion sat in him the way an old wound sits in cold weather, dull, constant, impossible to fully ignore. "I read that you reopened my mother's rooms," he wrote once, in the only letter that came close to saying something true. "It doesn't trouble me. If I'm honest, I'm relieved someone finally did it." He did not write the rest of what he felt reading her letters. That a stranger he had left half dying in a cold house was, by every account, reaching him, becoming someone entirely unlike the pale girl at the altar, and that this frightened him in a way artillery fire had not yet managed to. By the summer of 1900, Margaret Ashcombe had done what no duchess at Thornbury had done in 30 years. She had walked every tenant farm on the estate and learned every family's name. There was a farmer named Coyle, whose wife had died birthing their 4th child, and who had let the Westfield go fallow because grief had taken whatever was left of his attention after 4 children and a full day's labor. Margaret sat in his kitchen for 2 hours one October afternoon, said very little, and left him with an offer. The estate would take on a girl from the village to help with the children through winter, at no cost to him, in exchange for nothing but his agreement to try the field again in spring. He tried it. It came in better than it had in a decade. Not every test that autumn was so simple. In November, a hay barn on the Pruitt tenancy burned in the night, and Mr. Sedley arrived at the estate office the next morning already certain of the cause. "It was the Pruitt boy, Your Grace," he said. Careless with a lantern, same as his father was before him, he recommended the family be given notice before Michaelmas rents came due. Margaret rode out to the Pruitt farm herself before agreeing to anything, and found a 15-year-old boy with singed eyebrows and burned hands who had, in fact, been fighting the fire, not causing it. The true source, once she asked enough of the right questions, was a faulty flue that the previous land agent had been warned about twice in writing, and ignored both times.
The notice will not be served. The flue will be rebuilt at the estate's expense, and the boy will be seen by Dr. Fenwick for those hands today, not next week.
Mr. Sedley, who had assumed this would be the easiest decision of his month, found instead that he had nearly cost an innocent family their home on an assumption he hadn't bothered to test, and he did not make that mistake again. Word travels through a tenant estate, the way water travels through low ground, quietly and everywhere. By Christmas of 1900, the people who worked Thornbury's land had stopped speaking of the American Duchess and started speaking of Her Grace, and there is a weight to that shift that no contract, however carefully drafted, can purchase. Mrs. Whitcomb noticed it before anyone said it aloud. "I've served 3 duchesses in this house," she said one evening, setting down the tea things with more care than the task required. "Not one of them learned a tenant's Christian name inside 3 years. You learned 40 in 1.
Is that meant as a compliment?
It's meant as an observation. I don't waste compliments. But you may take it as one, if you're desperate for one, which I suspect you are, given how far away your husband appears to be." Margaret laughed, an actual laugh, unguarded, the first one that Room had heard from her in over a year, and something between the two women settled that night into a shape that would hold for the rest of their lives, whatever else happened to either of them. In December of 1900, the letters from South Africa stopped arriving altogether. Julian's column had been ambushed at a river drift outside Bloemfontein by a Boer commando that knew the ground better than any map the British Army carried. 3 officers were killed outright. Julian was thrown from his horse into the flooded drift, struck across the skull by something he never fully remembered, and left for dead among men who genuinely were. He was not dead. He was, for 11 weeks, unaccounted for, carried inland by a Boer farming family who found him half-drowned and chose, for reasons that had nothing to do with the war and everything to do with a dying man on their land, to nurse him rather than report him. He could not tell them his name for the first 9 days. When he finally could, they had no reliable way to send word anywhere, and the war had made every road a risk. The telegram that reached Thornbury Hall in January of 1901 did not say killed. It said missing, believed wounded, status unconfirmed, and there is very little in the English language crueler than those 4 words strung together, because they give you nothing to grieve and nothing to hope for cleanly, only an unbearable, open-ended waiting. Margaret read it standing in the front hall, and did not sit down, and did not cry in front of the footman who had delivered it, and went directly to the estate office and continued the work she had been doing before the telegram arrived, because she had learned by then that grief left unattended in that house tended to calcify into something worse than grief. She did cry, later, alone, in the reopened East Wing, in a room that had belonged to a mother-in-law she never met, surrounded by a strength she had built for herself and had never once expected to need on this question. It was into this uncertainty that Reginald Ashcombe arrived in February of 1901, with a black coat, a correct amount of sympathy, and an agenda he had clearly rehearsed on the train. Reginald was Julian's cousin, and next in line for the title should the worst prove true, and he had done the arithmetic on that possibility with more speed than good taste required.
I've come out of concern for the estate, Margaret. Nothing more.
You've come 6 weeks after the telegram, and you're calling me Margaret instead of Your Grace. I find both details informative.
He had the decency to look briefly caught, though it did not slow him down.
The estate cannot run indefinitely on hope, and a duchess with no legal standing to make binding decisions should the worst be confirmed. I'm only suggesting, that the sensible course is to allow me to assume provisional management of the finances now before matters become disorderly.
The marriage settlement gives me full standing over the household and tenant accounts regardless of Julian's status, provisional or otherwise. My father's lawyers were thorough people. Reginald, you may check the document yourself. I'll have Mr. Sedley bring it down.
This was true, and Reginald knew it was true, and had come anyway on the assumption that a frightened young widow in waiting would not know her own contract well enough to refuse him. He had miscalculated, and Margaret watched him recognize the miscalculation in real time, which was, she found, a genuinely satisfying thing to watch.
You may hold the paper, Your Grace, but you cannot hold a house together on stubbornness alone if he doesn't come back.
I've been holding it together for a year and a half. I'd like you to notice that before you assume I need your management of anything.
He left 3 days later, having accomplished nothing beyond confirming, to everyone in that house, exactly what kind of man he was, and exactly how little that man had understood about the woman he'd come to outmaneuver. It would be 4 more months before word came that Julian was alive. He surfaced, finally, in a British field hospital outside Kroonstad in May of 1901. Thin, scarred along one temple where the wound had healed badly, walking with a slight favor to his left leg that would never fully leave him, and carrying a silence that the hospital orderlies noted without knowing quite what to call it. He did not talk about the river. He did not talk about the farm that had kept him alive. He answered questions in as few words as the question allowed and spent most of his waking hours staring at nothing in particular. It was Corporal Hicks, recovering in the same ward from a fever of his own, who finally brought him the letters. They had followed him for months, redirected from camp to camp, several batches lost entirely, one parcel finally catching up to a man the army had, for 11 weeks, listed as possibly dead. There were 19 letters in the bundle Hicks set on his cot, tied with string by some clerk who had clearly given up trying to sort them by date. Julian read them in order anyway. It took him most of a night. The early letters were the ones he remembered. Careful, a little formal, a stranger writing dutifully to a stranger. Somewhere around the 8th or 9th, something shifted. The handwriting grew searer. The sentences grew longer, warmer, funnier. A woman describing a farmer's field come back to life, an old housekeeper's dry approval, a roof mended, a wing reopened, 40 tenant children's names learned by heart. Nowhere in 19 letters did she once ask him to come home. Nowhere did she once complain of being alone. By the last letter, written, he realized, only weeks after the telegram calling him missing must have reached her, she was still writing as though he might read it. I don't know if any of this finds you. She'd written, I've decided to keep writing anyway. It seems better than the alternative, which is stopping, and I'm not willing to stop. Corporal Hicks, watching from the next cot, said the only thing anyone had managed to say to Julian Ashcombe in 11 weeks that actually reached him. You look like a man who just found out he left something worth keeping. Might want to go and see about that, sir, before someone else notices it first." Julian did not answer, but he wrote to Thornbury Hall the next morning, the longest letter he had sent in a year and a half, and the first honest one, and for the first time since October of 1899, he found he was not relieved to be away from that house. He was afraid of how much he wanted to be back in it. "I read what you've built while I was gone," he wrote. "I don't fully understand what I'm allowed to feel about that, given how little I did to earn it. I only know I've stopped being able to picture the house without you in it. That unsettles me, and strangely, I don't want it to stop unsettling me. I am coming home as soon as they release me. I don't know what I'll be. When I arrive, I know what I want to find. I'm less certain I have any right to it. If you've ever changed your mind about someone from a distance, realized too late what you'd been careless with, that's the feeling this letter is trying to hold, and it's a feeling worth sitting with for a moment before we finish this. It took 10 more months for the release papers, the passage, and the war itself to finish its slow, grinding conclusion. Julian Ashcombe came home in March of 1902, weeks before peace was finally signed at Vereeniging, thinner than he'd left, marked in ways that would not fade, and entirely unprepared for what stood on the other side of his own front gate. Which returns us to where we began, a man standing at a mended gate, listening to laughter he did not recognize, afraid to open a door he had once been relieved to close behind him. He opened it. The drive was lined with bare trees coming into early bud. A groom he didn't recognize took his horse without being asked twice, competent and unbothered. The easy confidence of a house that runs well without needing him to say so. The front door opened before he reached it, and Mrs. Whitcomb stood in the frame, older, steadier, looking at him like proof that a difficult year had finally ended. "Your Grace." We had begun to give up hope of a specific date, though not, I should say, of the return itself.
The house looks different.
"It is different. You'll want to see the rest of it before you decide what you think." He found Margaret in the estate office, not waiting in a drawing room in her best dress as he had somewhere pictured, but at the desk, sleeves pushed back, going through the spring planting figures with Mr. Sedley at her shoulder. She looked up when the door opened, and for a long moment, neither of them moved, because the two people in that room had last stood together as a fevered girl and a man in a hurry to leave, and neither of those people was fully present anymore.
You're thinner than your letter suggested.
You're steadier than mine deserved.
It was not an embrace. It was not, yet, anything either of them had words for. Mr. Sedley excused himself with the quiet tact of a man who has learned over 18 months to recognize a conversation that does not require an audience. Julian looked around the room, ledgers organized in a hand he now recognized from 19 letters, a window unshuttered that had been shuttered for a decade, a house that had clearly stopped waiting for him to run it and had simply gotten on with the business of surviving and thriving without his permission.
I don't recognize this house.
You weren't in it long enough to recognize much of anything, Julian. That's rather the point I've spent 2 years proving to myself.
It landed harder than she meant it to, or perhaps exactly as hard as she meant it to. He absorbed it the way a man absorbs a true thing he has been dreading.
I know what I left you to.
Do you? Because I've had a great deal of time to consider what you left me to, and I'm not certain either of us fully understood it at the time.
For a moment, the room held the taut, undecided silence of two people choosing whether to fight or to finally stop performing for each other. Margaret chose.
I nearly died in the 9th week you were gone. Mrs. Whitcomb sat up 6 nights running so I wouldn't die alone in a house that had already sent its duke away. I learned to read a ledger because no one else was going to teach a duchess anything useful. I learned 40 tenants' names because it turned out to matter more than knowing which fork to use. None of it was for you. I won't pretend otherwise. I did it because I refused to be the sickly American nobody bothered to notice in the West Wing. But I would be lying if I said I didn't think of you, doing it, every single week.
Julian said nothing for a long moment. When he spoke, it was without the careful distance he'd used at the altar 2.5 years before.
I read every one of your letters in a hospital bed outside Kroonstad in the space of one night after not answering half of them for a year. I understood reading them that I had married a stranger out of necessity and left her to die out of relief, and that the stranger had built something I have absolutely no right to walk back into and claim. I came home anyway. I don't have a good argument for why you should let me.
I wasn't aware you needed a good argument. I was rather hoping you'd have an honest one.
That, it turned out, was the true crisis of Julian Ashcombe's homecoming. Not the mended roof, not the reopened wing, not even the 2.5 years apart. It was a man discovering that the house he'd built his identity around no longer needed rescuing, and having to decide whether he could accept a place in it on those terms rather than the terms he'd left with. Reginald Ashcombe, informed by telegram of his cousin's very inconvenient survival, arrived at Thornbury 4 days later with a final, poorly timed argument.
You'll forgive me for saying it plainly, Julian. You returned from that war changed. Everyone can see it. The leg, the silence, the way you flinch at the stable gate when it slams. A man in your condition might reasonably consider whether the estate is better served by formalizing what your wife has already been managing, rather than reasserting authority you may not be equal to.
It was, in its way, the cruelest thing anyone had said to Julian since the river drift, because it carried just enough truth to sting and just enough self-interest to be unforgivable. Margaret, standing in the doorway, opened her mouth to answer for him. Julian raised one hand, asking without words to be allowed to answer for himself.
You're right that I'm changed, Reginald. I flinch. I don't sleep well. I owe my life to a Boer farmer whose name I never properly learned, and I'll carry that debt and that river for the rest of my life. You're also right that my wife ran this estate better in my absence than I ever managed in my presence, and I intend to ask her, not tell her, how she'd like the two of us to run it together going forward. What you are wrong about is the conclusion. None of that makes me unfit to come home. It makes me, for the first time since I inherited this house, actually fit to be in it.
Reginald left the following morning and did not return, and the estate solicitors heard nothing further from him on the subject of provisional management, then or ever. That same night, Margaret woke to a sound she couldn't place at first, low, ragged, coming from the room down the corridor that had been prepared for Julian's return. She found him sitting upright in the dark, soaked through with sweat, one hand pressed hard against the old scar at his temple, still half inside a river that had stopped being real a year ago and had never once let go of him.
It's the water. I can hear it before I'm properly awake. I didn't think it would follow me home.
She did not ask if he was well. She could see plainly that he wasn't. She sat on the edge of the bed, closer than either of them had stood since the storm on the road 2.5 years before, and said nothing useful, because there was nothing useful to say, and instead simply stayed, her hand over the scar his own hand had been pressing, until his breathing slowed enough to match hers.
You don't have to tell me what happened at that river. Not tonight. Not ever, if you'd rather not. But you don't have to sit alone with it in this house either. I know something about not wanting to be alone with the worst thing that's happened to you.
He did not tell her that night, but he let her stay until he slept, and in the morning neither of them mentioned it, and something had nonetheless been settled between them that no ledger or contract had ever managed to settle. The following evening, Julian found Margaret in the reopened east wing, standing at the window of the room that had once been his mother's, watching the last light go out over the west field that Farmer Coyle had brought back from ruin.
I don't need to rescue you. I understand that now. I think some part of me married you believing I'd eventually be asked to.
I don't need rescuing, Julian. I never did. Not really. Not the way either of our fathers imagined it when they signed that contract. What I needed was someone to come home and mean it.
I mean it.
Then come in properly. Not as a duke inspecting his property, as whatever it is you actually want to be in this house.
He crossed the room, favoring the leg that would never fully heal, the old silence still sitting in him, and likely to for years, unguarded for the first time since a contract had made them strangers to each other in a cold October chapel. And Margaret Ashcombe, who had built a life out of a house no one expected her to survive in, let him in. Her father had bought her a title. Her husband had left her a house. Neither man, in the end, had given her the thing that mattered. She had built that herself out of a stubborn refusal to be forgotten, and it turned out to be the one thing worth coming home to. I think about how easy it is to mistake being rescued for being loved, and how much harder and better it is to be simply let in, after everything, by someone who finally means it. Has anyone ever come back into your life changed and asked to be let in rather than expecting to be welcomed? And did you let them? I'd like to know. It's the kind of question that seems to matter to more people than we usually admit.